The arrest of former child star Robert Blake is a documented history of severe physical abuse culminating in a fatal domestic homicide. Monetized by Hollywood while enduring extreme domestic battery as a child, his genuine trauma was later exploited to cast him in psychological crime thrillers. In 2001, the actor was arrested and charged with executing his wife with a gunshot to the head. Though criminally acquitted, a civil jury explicitly found him legally responsible for the murder, ordering a $30 million penalty that left him destitute. This is the cold reality of Hollywood exploitation. The amber glow of the Los Angeles streetlights caught the metallic sheen of a black 1991 Dodge Stealth parked quietly on Woodbridge Street. It was May 4th, 2001, just past 9:30 in the evening. The air in Studio City was cool, thick with the scent of jasmine and car exhaust. A block away, the neon sign of Vitello's Italian restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd. But inside the dark cabin of the Dodge Stealth, the silence was absolute, broken only by the steady mechanical ticking of a cooling engine. Slumped in the passenger seat was Bonnie Lee Bakley. She was bleeding to death. 2 rounds of 9mm ammunition had been fired at point-blank range. The first bullet shattered her right cheek, tearing through bone and tissue. The second struck her shoulder. The passenger side window was rolled down exactly halfway. It was a precise, calculated detail. A fully closed window would have shattered, potentially raining glass on the shooter and trapping them in the immediate vicinity. A fully open window would have exposed the shooter to the street. Halfway down was the Goldilocks zone for an executioner, allowing the barrel to enter the cabin while shielding the assailant from the inevitable high-velocity blowback of blood and organic matter. A few yards down the dark alleyway behind the restaurant, submerged beneath discarded cardboard and rotting food in a green municipal dumpster, lay the instrument of death. It was a Walther P38, a rugged, efficient, semi-automatic pistol originally manufactured for the German military during the Second World War. Its serial numbers had been meticulously obliterated, ground down to the bare metal. The entire weapon, from the grip to the slide, was coated in a fine layer of household oil, a crude but highly effective method to ensure not a single fingerprint could be lifted by crime scene technicians. Minutes later, the front door of a nearby residence was hammered open by a frantic, breathless man. He was 67 years old, his white hair disheveled, his face pale and contorted in panic. He demanded the homeowner call 911. He dry-heaved into the bushes, clutching his stomach, asking for a glass of water. This was Robert Blake, a veteran television star, a man whose face had been broadcast into millions of American living rooms for over 60 years. When the patrol cars arrived, their red and blue lights slicing through the quiet neighborhood, Blake delivered his timeline to the detectives with striking clarity. He and his wife had finished dinner at Vitello's. He had escorted her to the car, settling her into the passenger seat. Then he realized a fatal mistake. He had left his personal, legally registered, snub-nosed .38 special on the table inside the restaurant. He claimed he turned around, walked the half block back to Vitello's, retrieved his weapon, and returned to the Dodge Stealth. In that brief 3-minute window, while he was inside fetching a gun, a phantom had emerged from the shadows of Studio City, executed his wife, and vanished without a trace. It was a sequence of events so perfectly tragic, so neatly arranged, that seasoned homicide detectives immediately felt the chill of a rehearsed script. The blood pooling on the leather seats of the Dodge Stealth was real, but the architecture of this murder had not been constructed in a single night. The blueprint for this level of detached, calculating violence had been drafted decades earlier, far away from the quiet streets of Studio City, under the blinding, unforgiving Klieg lights of the Hollywood studio system. Long before the Walther P38 was dropped into a dumpster, Robert Blake was Michael James Gubitosi, born in 1933 in Nutley, New Jersey. The Great Depression was ravaging the country, and the Gubitosi household was a place of desperation. His parents, Giacomo and Elizabeth, were failed vaudeville performers. In an era where children were expected to be seen and not heard, the Gubitosi children were expected to be profitable. Completely denied a traditional childhood, Michael was born directly into a grueling industrial enterprise. By the time he was 2 years old, before he could form coherent memories of a mother's affection or a father's protection, he was thrust onto the stage. He was billed alongside his siblings as the Three Little Hillbillies, a grotesque miniature act designed to extract coins from impoverished audiences. The family migrated to Los Angeles, chasing the lucrative machinery of the motion picture industry. In 1939, at the age of 6, Michael was absorbed into the Hal Roach Studios, cast in the wildly popular Our Gang comedy shorts. To the American public, he was rebranded as Mickey, the tough, adorable, gap-toothed kid who navigated the harmless, comedic scrapes of childhood. On screen, he was the embodiment of resilience and joy. Off-screen, he was the primary breadwinner for a family that viewed him exclusively as a piece of heavy machinery. The transition from the soundstage to the family home was a descent into a private hell. Giacomo Gubitosi was an alcoholic whose failures and frustrations were violently extracted from the flesh of his most profitable asset. Escalating far beyond mere discipline, the physical beatings manifested as systematic and brutal trauma. The young boy was routinely whipped with leather belts, struck with closed fists, and subjected to psychological torture that shattered his fundamental understanding of safety. When he missed a cue, forgot a line, or simply behaved like an exhausted 6-year-old, the punishments escalated. He was frequently dragged into a small, windowless closet, locked in the suffocating darkness for hours to learn his lines or repent for his perceived failures. The degradation did not stop at physical violence. In a household stripped of basic human dignity, Giacomo regularly forced his son to eat his meals off the floor, kneeling on the linoleum like a trained animal, reinforcing the narrative that the boy was subhuman, valuable only for the paychecks he generated. Years later, Blake would cryptically but firmly allude to unspeakable violations occurring behind closed doors, a final devastating trauma that permanently severed his connection to childhood innocence. This domestic terror was not a tightly kept secret. The Hollywood machine was inherently complicit. Every morning, a terrified, bruised child was delivered to the gates of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Directors, producers, cameramen, and script supervisors saw the flinching. They saw the defensive posture of a child expecting to be struck. They saw the dark, blooming bruises on his arms and legs. But the production schedule was an immovable force. A single day of shooting cost thousands of dollars. The cameras had to roll. The solution was not intervention, it was max factor. Makeup artists were instructed to apply heavy layers of grease paint to the child's skin, effectively burying the evidence of felony child abuse beneath a mask of cinematic perfection. The studio system taught Michael Gubitosi a terrifying lifelong lesson. His pain was completely invisible to the world. It did not matter that he was bleeding or broken so long as he hit his mark, found his light, and delivered the punchline. The adults surrounding him, the men in fine suits who controlled the industry, were willing to look an abused child in the eye and call action. As the years dragged on, the boy absorbed the reality of his environment. He was surrounded by other child stars, members of the Our Gang roster, who were also buckled under the immense pressure of supporting their families and satisfying the studios. He watched as they were systematically discarded once puberty stripped away their marketable cuteness. The industry had no use for awkward teenagers. The contracts were shredded. The studio passes were revoked. He witnessed the aftermath firsthand. He watched his peers spiral into severe alcoholism, drug addiction, and profound mental illness. The most jarring example was Carl Alfalfa Switzer, the beloved freckle-faced star of the series, who would eventually be shot to death in a dispute over $50 for a lost hunting dog. The public would later dub this phenomenon the Our Gang curse, a superstitious label for systemic failure. But for the young Robert Blake, it was not a curse, it was empirical evidence. It was the statistical reality of what happened to children who were chewed up by the Hollywood factory and spat out into a world they were unequipped to navigate. Rather than tragic anomalies, death, violence, and ruin served strictly as the standard conclusion to the child star script. When the Our Gang series finally ran its course in 1944, Michael Gubitosi was fundamentally broken. The persona of Mickey was dead. He navigated his teenage years adrift, eventually being drafted into the United States Army in the 1950s. The military provided a rigid structure, but it could not cure the profound psychological rot festering inside him. The trauma had merely calcified. Upon his discharge and return to civilian life, the first true manifestation of his internal darkness breached the surface. He became involved with a young woman, a relationship that quickly soured. The woman's father, alarmed by Blake's volatile behavior, intervened, resulting in a brief, humiliating arrest for the former child star. For a normal individual, this might have been a wake-up call, a moment to step back and reassess. For a man raised in a closet, beaten for existing, and taught that the world was a predatory arena, it was an act of war. Bypassing legal counsel or peaceful mediation, Blake immediately visited a hardware store, purchased a firearm, and began to stalk the father. He meticulously tracked the man's movements, learning his routines, determining the optimal location and time to execute him. The murder was only averted because a mutual acquaintance discovered the plot and managed to physically and verbally intervene, defusing the situation before the trigger was pulled. The public never knew. The police were never called. But the psychological threshold had been permanently crossed. Robert Blake had looked at a problem, a grievance, an obstacle in his path, and calmly concluded that premeditated murder was a logical, viable solution. The battered child had realized he no longer had to cower in the dark. He could become the monster in the closet. The seed of the Walther P38 had been planted. It only needed time and the right target to bloom. By the late 1950s, Michael Gubitosi had legally vanished. In his place stood Robert Blake, a stage name forged in a desperate attempt to sever the psychological tether to the battered boy in the oversized trousers. He enrolled in acting classes, attempting to learn the craft of human emotion that he had never been permitted to naturally experience. But a legal name change does not rewrite neurochemistry. The trauma had merely gone dormant, waiting for a catalyst. Hollywood did not offer Robert Blake therapy. It offered him a mirror, and it paid him handsomely to stare into it. The turning point arrived in 1967. Director Richard Brooks was preparing the film adaptation of Truman Capote's monumental true crime novel, In Cold Blood. The narrative chronicled the senseless, brutal slaughter of the Clutter family in rural Kansas by two drifters. One of those killers was Perry Smith, a man defined by a violently abusive childhood, a transient existence, and a deep, festering resentment towards a world that had discarded him. When Brooks cast the film, he actively bypassed polished, classically trained leading men. He required an actor who did not have to imagine the suffocating weight of a shattered youth. He looked at Robert Blake and saw the exact contours of Perry Smith's damage. The production of In Cold Blood was an exercise in macabre authenticity. Brooks filmed in the actual Clutter residence, forcing his crew and cast to walk the exact floorboards where 4 people had been bound and executed. For Blake, far exceeding a standard acting exercise, playing Perry Smith required a grueling psychological exhumation. When the cameras rolled, the feral hostility, the sudden twitching paranoia, and the dead-eyed stare were not manufactured choices. Blake was actively mining the darkest recesses of his own unresolved history. In one of the film's most chilling sequences, Smith recounts his father's brutality before ascending the gallows. The black and white cinematography of Conrad Hall holds tight on Blake's face as rain streams down the window pane, casting shadows that look like tears across his stoic features. The hollowness in his eyes in that moment was an artifact of genuine, unhealed agony. The critics hailed it as a masterpiece of method acting. The reality was far more disturbing. Blake had discovered that society, which had ignored his suffering as a child, would reward him with fame and critical adulation if he weaponized that trauma on 35mm film. The industry was validating his internal violence. This critical triumph forged a dangerous neural pathway. Blake realized that the aggression he had commercialized for decades was a highly marketable commodity. Abandoning any genuine pursuit of healing, he simply sought out scripts capable of accommodating his immense rage. By the mid-1970s, this dark persona was commercialized and broadcast into millions of homes via the ABC television network. Blake was cast as the lead in Beretta, playing an unconventional, street-smart undercover detective who lived in a rundown hotel with a cockatoo. Tony Beretta was the ultimate junkyard dog, a man who operated entirely on the fringes of procedure, dispensing justice through intimidation, physical force, and a total disregard for authority. The public devoured the anti-hero narrative, propelling the show to massive ratings and earning Blake an Emmy Award. But the boundary between the fictional detective and the fractured actor dissolved almost immediately. The set of Beretta was not a professional workplace. It was a hostile environment held hostage by its star. Blake leaned into the junkyard dog persona to mask a crippling terror of vulnerability. Off camera, he was notoriously explosive. He medicated his deep-seated insecurities with heavy sustained cocaine and alcohol abuse. The crew lived in constant fear of his unpredictable outbursts. He physically assaulted stuntmen during takes, throwing punches that were not pulled. He shattered set dressings in fits of rage, berated directors, and demanded absolute dictatorial control over the production. The studio executives, mirroring the behavior of the MGM bosses from the 1930s, chose to look the other way. The show was generating immense advertising revenue. The collateral damage to the crew's safety and Blake's deteriorating mental state was deemed an acceptable operating cost. Once again, Hollywood was systematically enabling his self-destruction, building a fortress of money and sycophants around a man who was actively spiraling out of control. Blake openly admitted during this era that he used his aggressive reputation as a shield. He projected madness so that no one would dare get close enough to see the broken child hiding beneath the surface. Decades of playing marginalized, violent men fundamentally rewired his perception of conflict resolution. He had spent his entire adult life simulating murder, handling firearms, and adopting the psychology of killers. The psychological partition between the real world and the cinematic underworld eroded to dust. This dangerous convergence reached its zenith in 1993 when Blake accepted the lead role in the television film Judgment Day, the John List story. The script was based on the true case of an ostensibly devout, mild-mannered accountant who methodically executed his wife, his mother, and his 3 children in their New Jersey mansion. List did not kill in a fit of passionate rage. He killed with terrifying pragmatic calm, viewing the annihilation of his family as a logical, necessary solution to his mounting financial and domestic failures. He arranged their bodies on sleeping bags, cleaned the crime scene, turned on classical music, and disappeared to start a new life. To prepare for the role, Blake immersed himself in List's sociopathy. He studied the mechanics of a mind that could completely detach emotion from the act of taking human life. The performance was suffocatingly accurate, replacing the theatrical anger of his past roles with a chilling, calculated emptiness. It was a masterclass in the portrayal of a domestic executioner. It was also a psychological dress rehearsal. By the late 1990s, Robert Blake's career had stalled. The industry that had tolerated his erratic behavior when he was a primetime draw no longer had the patience for an aging, difficult actor. The phone stopped ringing. The Hollywood machine, having extracted the last ounce of his marketable trauma, quietly locked him out. He retreated to his heavily fortified compound in the San Fernando Valley, living in self-imposed exile. He was a man composed of defense mechanisms, isolated, paranoid, and steeped in the mechanics of on-screen homicide. The stage was perfectly set. He only required a co-star to trigger the final, inevitable descent into darkness. Autumn 1999. The interior of the La Bakeley Jazz Club in Studio City was a sanctuary for Hollywood's faded aristocracy. A dark room heavy with cigarette smoke and the sharp scent of scotch. Robert Blake sat in the shadows, a 66-year-old man completely isolated by his own engineered hostility. He was a wealthy ghost, physically deteriorating and deeply paranoid. Across the room, scanning the tables with the cold, methodical precision of an apex predator, was Bonnie Lee Bakley, shattering the illusion of an innocent civilian stumbling into a dangerous actor's orbit. Bakeley operated as a hardened professional, operating in the subterranean economy of emotional extortion. Born in New Jersey, she had spent the previous 3 decades meticulously building a lucrative criminal enterprise. Her business model was a predatory, lonely heart scam. Operating under dozens of aliases, she placed advertisements in the back pages of men's magazines across the United States. She targeted a highly specific demographic: older, isolated, socially awkward men holding steady blue-collar jobs. She mailed them letters expressing deep manufactured affection, accompanied by explicit photographs of women she claimed to be herself. She recorded audio cassettes whispering promises of marriage and companionship. Once a mark was emotionally compromised, the extraction phase began. She requested money for rent, for travel expenses to visit them, for fabricated medical emergencies. Over the years, Bakley maintained hundreds of post office boxes and bilked thousands of men out of their life savings. It was a high-volume, low-risk racket, but petty cash from Midwestern factory workers was merely funding her ultimate ambition. Bakley was pathologically obsessed with celebrity. She possessed an extensive, highly targeted hit list of Hollywood figures. She had stalked singer Jerry Lee Lewis, briefly infiltrating his inner circle. She had relentlessly pursued Dean Martin. By the time she walked into the Bakeley Jazz Club and locked eyes with Robert Blake, she had already been married at least 10 times, leaving a trail of discarded identities, forged documents, and arrest warrants for mail fraud and identity theft in her wake. Their initial encounter was a collision of 2 highly manipulative personalities, each convinced they held the upper hand. Blake sought temporary, uncomplicated physical companionship to break the crushing silence of his compound. Bakley saw an aging, vulnerable millionaire and a direct pipeline to the Hollywood legitimacy she craved. The relationship was devoid of romance. It was a transaction. But Bakley's strategy relied on biological leverage. Within months, she was pregnant. True to her nature as a seasoned grifter, she immediately hedged her bets, executing a parallel scam. While sleeping with Blake, she had also managed to seduce Christian Brando, the son of cinematic icon Marlon Brando. Christian was a man deeply damaged by his own family tragedies. Having recently served a prison sentence for manslaughter, he was highly susceptible to manipulation. When the child was born in June 2000, Bakley played her masterstroke of deception. She looked at Robert Blake and denied his paternity. She then legally named the infant girl Christian Shannon Brando. She presented the child to the Brando family, demanding financial support and attempting to anchor herself to one of the most powerful dynasties in American film history. For Robert Blake, this betrayal triggered a catastrophic psychological shift. His entire adult life had been defined by a desperate need for absolute control, a defense mechanism built over the physical abuse of his childhood. The idea that a career criminal was parading a child that might belong to him, using that child as a chip in a high-stakes Hollywood casino, was intolerable. Ignoring standard family court petitions entirely, he demanded a DNA test utilizing sheer intimidation. The laboratory results returned with forensic certainty. Christian Brando was excluded. Robert Blake was the biological father. The child was swiftly renamed Rose Lenore Sophia Blake. The confirmation of paternity did not ignite a sudden spark of paternal warmth in Blake. It ignited a territorial war. He looked at Bonnie Lee Bakley and saw a terminal threat. She was a woman with a rap sheet spanning several states, a woman who had spent her life selling lies and extracting cash. Blake was terrified she would take the child, vanish into her network of aliases, and extort him for the rest of his natural life. Operating under the logic of the television detectives he had portrayed for decades, Blake bypassed the legal system and activated his own private intelligence network. He hired a seasoned private investigator, Brian Allen, handing him a blank check and a singular directive: destroy Bonnie Lee Bakley's credibility and find a legal mechanism to have her incarcerated. Allen's investigation quickly unearthed Bakley's criminal footprint in Arkansas. She had outstanding felony warrants for possessing multiple driver's licenses under false names and passing fraudulent checks. In Blake's mind, this was the tactical solution. If Bakley was arrested and extradited to an Arkansas penitentiary, she would automatically be deemed an unfit mother. Blake would gain full, uncontested custody of Rose, and the parasite would be permanently excised from his life. What followed was a paranoid, highly illegal contingency plan that blurred the line between reality and a cheap pulp thriller. Blake allegedly ordered his operatives to engineer a scenario where Bakley would be planted with narcotics or coerced into driving across state lines, straight into the jurisdiction of the Arkansas police. However, this desperate scheme remained a frantic concept rather than an executed operation. Bakley was a seasoned predator deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld. She recognized the shifting dynamics of her environment and stubbornly refused to leave the state of California. With his covert operation exposed and his options dwindling, Blake was forced into a corner. The only legal mechanism left to secure absolute control over his daughter was the one institution he despised: marriage. In November 2000, Robert Blake and Bonnie Lee Bakley were married. Stripped of any romantic union, the marriage functioned strictly as a hostage negotiation, formalized by a notary public. Before the ceremony, Bakley was forced to sign a draconian prenuptial agreement. The document was a legal weapon, meticulously stripping her of any right to Blake's millions, his properties, or his residual royalties. She signed it because her ultimate goal was proximity to the wealth, believing she could manipulate the situation from the inside. The wedding day was a bleak, joyless affair. There were no photographs, no celebrations, no guests. Immediately following the signing of the papers, Blake drove his new wife to a cheap roadside motel. The honeymoon was an exercise in calculated humiliation. Blake occupied the single bed in the room. He ordered Bonnie Lee Bakley to sleep on a canvas folding cot placed on the floor. The living arrangements upon returning to Blake's sprawling Mata Margarita compound in Hidden Hills were even more extreme. The estate was instantly transformed into a high-security prison. Blake resided in the heavily fortified main house, surrounded by his firearms and his paranoia. Bakley was banished to a small, dilapidated guest house located at the rear of the property. A chain-link fence separated the two structures. Blake installed surveillance cameras pointing directly at the guest house, monitoring her every movement. Her telephone lines were allegedly tapped. She was not permitted to enter the main house without explicit prior authorization. Blake openly and frequently referred to his legal wife as a pig, a whore, and a grifter to anyone who would listen, including his domestic staff, his private investigators, and his Hollywood acquaintances. Inside the guest house, Bakley was not idle. She continued to run her lonely heart scams via mail, managing her post office boxes, unfazed by the hostile environment. She was waiting him out, confident that his age and deteriorating health would eventually leave her in control of the estate regardless of the prenuptial agreement. By the spring of 2001, the Mata Margarita compound had reached a critical mass of psychological pressure. Two predators were locked in a cage of their own design, engaged in a daily war of attrition. Blake was exhausted, his millions offering no protection against the relentless presence of the woman he despised. The legal avenues were exhausted. The intimidation tactics had failed. The prenuptial agreement only chained them closer together. For a man who had spent his childhood learning that violence was the ultimate authority and his adulthood getting paid to simulate murder, the situation presented only one logical conclusion. The script had written itself into a corner. The only way to roll the credits was to introduce a firearm into the third act. The yellow crime scene tape was pulled taut across the intersection of Woodbridge Street and Tujunga Avenue, transforming a quiet, affluent stretch of Studio City into an active forensic laboratory. By midnight on May 4th, the Los Angeles Police Department's elite robbery homicide division had taken operational control. The detectives who arrived on the scene were veterans of the city's darkest hours, men accustomed to the chaotic aftermath of gang violence and domestic slaughter. But the scene surrounding the Black Dodge Stealth possessed a chilling, clinical sterility. It did not look like a robbery gone wrong. It looked like an execution. Detectives Ron Ito and Tommy King began the meticulous process of reverse engineering a murder. They approached the vehicle, their flashlights cutting through the heavy California night. Inside the cabin, Bonnie Lee Bakley was dead, her body secured in the passenger seat. The forensic geometry of the strike was devastatingly precise. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment noted the entry wound on her right cheek. The bullet had traveled at a slightly downward trajectory, severing the brainstem and lodging in her neck. A second round had struck her right shoulder. The physical configuration of the car offered the first major discrepancy in the narrative of a random attack. The passenger side window was lowered exactly halfway. To the trained eye of a homicide investigator, this was a glaring anomaly. A random street mugger or a panicked carjacker operates on adrenaline, usually firing through the glass or forcing the door open. Firing through a half-open window requires calculation. It demands the shooter step intimately close to the vehicle, insert the barrel into the narrow gap, and pull the trigger. The glass barrier serves a dual purpose. It traps the victim inside the acoustic chamber of the car, muffling the gunshot to the surrounding neighborhood, and crucially, it acts as a physical shield against high-velocity blood spatter. The detectives turned their attention to the husband. Robert Blake was seated in the back of a black and white patrol cruiser, visibly shaking, wrapped in a blanket provided by paramedics. His physical presentation was carefully documented. He was wearing dark clothing, a black shirt, dark trousers. He was not crying. His demeanor fluctuated between hyperventilation and a state of intense, almost theatrical shock. They escorted Blake to the North Hollywood station for formal questioning and the immediate collection of physical evidence. The priority was his clothing and his hands. When a semi-automatic weapon is discharged, a microscopic cloud of vaporized heavy metals, barium, antimony, and lead, erupts from the ejection port and the barrel. This is gunshot residue, or GSR. It settles on the skin, the hair, and the fabric of the shooter. In a point-blank execution, the presence of GSR on the hands is usually definitive. A technician swabbed Blake's hands and secured his clothing, sealing the samples in sterile vials to be rushed to the crime lab. The results, returned later, would become the central battleground of the entire investigation. The lab identified exactly one particle of characteristic gunshot residue on Blake's hands and 4 particles on his clothing. It was a forensic nightmare. A combined total of 5 particles was an infinitesimally small amount. If Blake had fired the Walther P38 at close range, his hands and cuffs should have been heavily dusted with the chemical signature of the ammunition. A reading of 0 particles would have pointed toward his innocence. A dense reading would have guaranteed a conviction. The microscopic trace evidence existed in a maddening gray area. It was enough to prove he had been in the proximity of a discharged firearm, but legally insufficient to definitively prove he was the executioner. The defense for this anomaly had already been planted by Blake himself. His alibi, the forgotten revolver in the restaurant, provided the perfect forensic countermeasure. Blake possessed a permit to carry a concealed weapon. The weapon he claimed to have left behind at Vitello's was a snub-nosed .38 special. He admitted to handling that gun earlier in the evening. The minimal GSR on his hands could easily be argued in court as secondary transfer from his own unfired weapon, severing the chemical link between his hands and the murder. Detectives confiscated Blake's clothing and subjected every inch of the fabric to luminol testing and microscopic inspection. They were searching for the invisible mist of blood that blows back when a bullet strikes human tissue. The dark fabric yielded nothing. Not a single drop, flake, or mist of Bonnie Lee Bakley's blood was found on Robert Blake. With the physical evidence failing to definitively anchor the suspect to the trigger, investigators retraced the timeline, walking the exact path Blake claimed to have taken. They measured the distance from the parked Dodge Stealth on Woodbridge Street to the front door of Vitello's restaurant. It was roughly 150 yards. A brisk walk would take approximately 2 minutes each way. According to Blake's official statement, he realized his .38 special had slipped out of his clothing and into the booth. He left his wife in the car, walked back to the restaurant, retrieved the gun, and returned. But when detectives interviewed the staff and patrons at Vitello's, the timeline began to fracture. Witnesses remembered seeing Blake return to the restaurant. However, their accounts did not align with a man quickly retrieving a forgotten item from a table. The busboy who cleared Blake's booth testified that there was no weapon left on the seats or under the table. Other patrons recalled seeing Blake hovering near the front entrance, pacing near the restrooms, appearing anxious but devoid of the urgency of a man who had left a loaded firearm in a public dining room. He lingered. He bought time. The weapon recovered from the industrial dumpster further dismantled the theory of a random street crime. The LAPD firearms unit examined the Walther P38. It was an antique, a piece of heavy steel designed for trench warfare, not a typical weapon utilized by Los Angeles street gangs or petty thieves. The serial numbers had been filed off with heavy machinery, a deliberate act requiring time and access to a workshop. The heavy coating of household oil was the final chilling detail. The oil was not for lubrication. It was applied to ensure the textured grip and the metal slide would not hold a single latent fingerprint, and to degrade any touch DNA left by the shooter's sweat or skin cells. This level of preparation indicated a sophisticated, premeditated assassination. A random killer does not bring an untraceable, oiled World War II antique to a mugging, shoot a woman twice without stealing her purse, and meticulously drop the weapon into a nearby dumpster. The crime scene was staged. The weapon was a prop designed to disappear. As the sun rose over Studio City on the morning of May 5th, the robbery homicide detective stood in the precinct, staring at a whiteboard filled with circumstantial anomalies. They had a dead woman with a long list of enemies, a husband who had spent his life playing murderers on television, an alibi that felt scripted, and a crime scene devoid of the physical evidence required to make an arrest. Robert Blake walked out of the police station a free man, heavily flanked by expensive defense attorneys. The trap had been perfectly set, but the LAPD knew that a man who had spent 60 years learning how to build a scene would eventually make a mistake when forced to improvise. They just had to dig deeper into the Hollywood shadows to find it. For 11 agonizing months following the execution at Vitello's, the Los Angeles Police Department meticulously built a cage around the Mata Margarita compound. The investigation expanded across 20 states, generating thousands of pages of interviews, forensic reports, and background checks. The Robbery Homicide Division knew they were dealing with a man who had spent a lifetime studying the mechanics of crime and punishment on television. They needed a witness who could break the pristine silence of the Dodge Stealth. They found two. On April 18th, 2002, the quiet exclusivity of Hidden Hills was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of news helicopters. Heavily armed tactical units breached the gates of Robert Blake's estate. The man who had spent the 1970s kicking down doors as Detective Tony Beretta was ordered out of his home, his hands pulled behind his back and secured in cold steel. The television cop was read his Miranda rights on his own manicured lawn. The charge was murder with special circumstances. The prosecution's case did not hinge on the 5 microscopic particles of gunshot residue, nor did it rely on the untraceable Walther P38 found in the dumpster. The state of California built its foundation on the testimonies of Gary McLarty and Ronald Hambleton. These were not rival actors or studio executives. They were veteran Hollywood stuntmen. In the cinematic ecosystem, stuntmen are the blue-collar workers who absorb the physical trauma the leading men refuse to take. They are men accustomed to broken bones, concussions, and the heavy reliance on narcotics to numb the chronic pain. Blake had orbited their world for decades. According to the prosecution, when Blake decided his legal options regarding Bonnie Lee Bakley were exhausted, bypassing professional hitmen from the criminal underworld, he directly solicited the men he already knew. McLarty and Hambleton were brought to the witness stand. Under oath, they delivered narratives that stripped away the mystery of May 4th. They testified that Blake had aggressively solicited them to pop his wife. He offered $10,000 in cash. More damningly, they claimed Blake had effectively pitched them a script. He detailed a scenario where Bakley would be lured to a dark location, specifically mentioning the area around Vitello's restaurant in Studio City. He outlined the alibi he would use, explaining how he would step away to create a window of opportunity for the shooter. It was a staggering revelation. If true, Robert Blake had not just committed a murder, he had functioned as the director of his wife's assassination, auditioning killers for the leading role. However, the courtroom is an environment governed by perception, and the defense team understood the inherent vulnerabilities of the prosecution's star witnesses. McLarty and Hambleton carried extensive documented histories of severe drug addiction. The defense attorneys launched a brutal surgical cross-examination, tearing into the men's credibility. They exposed McLarty's history of cocaine-induced psychosis, forcing him to admit on the stand that he had once believed police were tracking him through his television set. The defense painted the stuntmen not as reluctant witnesses to a conspiracy, but as desperate, burnt-out addicts willing to fabricate a story to appease the police and secure lucrative tabloid payouts. In the eyes of the jury, reasonable doubt began to fracture the prosecution's narrative. Simultaneously, the jury was subjected to the final and perhaps greatest performance of Robert Blake's career. The aggressive, muscular junkyard dog who had terrorized television sets and intimidated his wife had vanished. The man seated at the defense table was a frail, diminutive 71-year-old. He stopped dyeing his hair, allowing it to grow out in a shock of stark white. He wore oversized suits that hung off his shrinking frame. He appeared exhausted, bewildered, and physically incapable of executing the precision strike that ended Bonnie Lee Bakley's life. He routinely openly wept into his hands. He leaned heavily on his lawyers, a dyslexic old man seemingly crushed by the infinite resources of the state. The strategy was flawless. The prosecution could not definitively link the gun to his hand. They could not explain the total absence of blood spatter on his clothing. Their primary witnesses were compromised by heavy narcotics use. On March 16, 2005, the Los Angeles courtroom fell dead silent as the verdict was read. Not guilty. Robert Blake collapsed forward, his head resting on the heavy oak table, his shoulders heaving with sobs. He had beaten the Hollywood ending. He had walked out of a locked room mystery of his own design. But the justice system possesses two distinct arenas, and the victory in the criminal court offered no protection against the vengeance of the civil court. Within months, the children of Bonnie Lee Bakley filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the actor. The civil trial was a completely different battlefield. The burden of proof shifted drastically. The jury no longer had to believe Blake was a murderer beyond a reasonable doubt. They only needed to be convinced by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it was more likely than not that he was responsible for her death. The civil jury reviewed the exact same timeline, the exact same forensic anomalies, and the exact same testimonies of the stuntmen. Stripped of the overwhelming pressure of sending an old man to a penitentiary, they looked at the facts with cold clarity. They saw a man trapped in a hostile marriage, fighting for control of his daughter, who miraculously avoided a spray of bullets because he conveniently forgot a revolver beside a plate of pasta. On November 18th, 2005, the civil jury returned their verdict. They found Robert Blake liable for the intentional murder of his wife. He was not sentenced to prison, but he was sentenced to absolute financial ruin. The jury ordered him to pay $30 million in damages to Bakeley's estate. Even after an appeals court later halved the penalty to $15 million, the economic devastation was total. The millions accumulated over 60 years of relentless work in the Hollywood machine were instantly vaporized. The legal fees had already bled him dry. Blake filed for bankruptcy. The sprawling, heavily fortified Meta Margarita compound in Hidden Hills was sold off to satisfy creditors. His Screen Actors Guild pensions were garnished. The man who had generated untold wealth for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and the ABC network was reduced to a pensioner, forced into a modest, cramped apartment in the sprawling anonymity of Los Angeles. The industry that had nurtured his darkness, that had profited from his unhealed trauma, permanently locked him out. No director would insure him, no studio would hire him. He became a toxic asset, a ghost haunting the fringes of the city that had created him. The isolation triggered a final severe psychological deterioration. The mask of the frail, weeping victim he had worn during the criminal trial dissolved, revealing the unrepentant rage beneath. In 2012, he granted a rare televised interview to British broadcaster Piers Morgan. Displaying absolutely zero interest in public redemption, the man appearing on screen remained deeply hostile, leaning aggressively into the camera. When pressed about the night of the murder, his demeanor was terrifyingly combative. He refused to express a single ounce of sorrow for Bonnie Lee Bakley. He verbally attacked the interviewer, pointing a trembling, furious finger. He referred to his dead wife strictly in derogatory terms, reiterating her history as a con artist and a grifter. There was no grace. There was no closure. There was only a man fiercely defending the narrative he had constructed, demanding the world accept his version of reality through sheer intimidation. It was a chilling echo of the anger that had defined his entire adult life, proving to anyone watching that the capacity for extreme violence had never truly left him. His final years were spent entirely alone in his apartment. The paranoia that had defined his marriage consumed his solitary existence. He severed ties with almost everyone who had stood by him during the trials. Visitors who occasionally breached his self-imposed exile reported a deeply disturbing environment. The walls of his apartment were covered in erratic handwritten scrawlings. He had turned his living space into a physical manifestation of his deteriorating mind. Among the chaotic notes, one sentence was repeatedly written: a brutal, self-inflicted epitaph. No friends, no family, no wife, no kids. The child star who had been beaten in a dark closet by his father had ultimately built a new closet for himself. He had successfully pushed away every human connection, retreating into a fortress of absolute bitterness. On March 9th, 2023, the long, violent script finally concluded. Robert Blake died of heart disease at the age of 89. There was no grand Hollywood memorial. There were no studio tributes. He died quietly, an isolated old man in a city that had long since forgotten him. The file on Robert Blake forces a deeply uncomfortable reckoning with the nature of the entertainment industry. His legacy is not merely a cautionary tale of a fallen star. It is an indictment of the studio system itself. Hollywood subsidized a tragedy. It built a lucrative asset from a broken child, profited immensely from his televised rage, and when the violence inevitably bled off the screen, it simply locked him in the dark and walked away.